television personality Bill Maher claims that 2020's $6 trillion COVID relief package is to blame for skyrocketing inflation. Here's what he said.
And interest rates spiked, right, because of inflation.
Yes.
That's why they had to. Okay, so when Uncle Sugar was very generous during COVID, right, that was the result of that. That's what caused the inflation, a lot of what caused the inflation. You cannot put $6 trillion that you don't have in people's pockets and not expect some inflation. That's what caused this rate, and that's so it's all connected.
So inflation has multifaceted causes. I think runaway government spending is one of them. What do you say, Brianna?
Well, it's interesting how he framed interest rates spiking in the passive tense, as though the Fed didn't make the decision to raise interest rates to curb inflation. So their plan, and the plan that people have been pushing back on from the left and from the working classes, is that there seems to be a real appetite for suppressing wages, driving lowering the ability for workers to make demands in the workplace in order to bring down demand, as opposed to addressing the issues at the very top. So Bill Maher argues that this is a consequence of abundant COVID-era spending, that people have too much money in their pockets, when, of course, the statistics show that the richest 1% bagged nearly twice as much wealth as the rest of the world put together over the past 2 years since 2020. We've seen statistics about how the majority, I think about half of all of the COVID spending went to businesses, not to the payments that went into people's pockets to pay for rent and groceries and the like. And you never hear this kind of discourse, this kind of rhetoric being used when we're talking about something like the Trump tax plans, which went overwhelmingly to the top 1% of Americans. So why is it that when we're talking about spending, when we're talking about inflationary effects, we're not talking about bringing down inflation in the four sectors that are driving inflation, which include education and healthcare and housing? And why aren't we talking about the root causes of those things, and instead pretending as though individuals who are still struggling, by the way, to afford groceries in a country where there's no limit on price gouging, where we have ample evidence that that is in fact what's going on at these corporations that have been making money hand over fist during this crisis. Why is the onus only on controlling the spending and the ability of the poor to afford their basic livelihood?
Why do we never talk about controlling spending related to defense?
Correct.
And all of those things, which, as much money as Ukraine needs is the position Biden has articulated, and we can talk about how that could have an inflationary effect.
Or bailouts to massive banks that host the billions of dollars of tech bros. Meanwhile, comedian Jon Stewart interviewed former Secretary of the Treasury Larry Summers about the financial woes burdening Americans, particularly the working class. Here is a snippet of the conversation on Friday's episode of his show, The Problem with Jon Stewart. Let's watch.
Every worker should get as high a wage as they can. It would be a terrible idea.
But the Fed is going to intervene. The Fed is going to intervene to make that not possible.
No, the Fed is intervening to control the overall level of demand growth.
And what will that do to the labor market?
Much faster.
What will that do to the labor market? What will it do to the labor market? It will loosen
likely to lead to
looser labor markets.
A somewhat looser labor market.
Now, Batya, I know you're not a big fan of Jon Stewart because we reacted to another clip of him, and you just don't care for him. What did you think of this one?
Well, all right. So some of the points he made in this interview were extremely important points I agree with. Points you basically just made, Brianna. Why is it that the working class who suffers the most from inflation is always asked to bear the burden of taming inflation, right? So raising interest rates is done with the explicit design of limiting investment, which is explicitly designed to increase unemployment. Right? They want people unemployed. They want, when they talk about rising wages for the working class, they talk about it with dismay, right? Because they believe that that's where the inflation is coming from. Of course, it's complicated. The supply chain crisis is a huge deal. And one can so easily imagine ways of taming inflation that assist the bottom and target the top, as we've been talking about last week, this week, etc. My problem with Jon Stewart is I think that Larry Summers actually owned him in this interview. He did a very good job job of making the counter argument, which is that the cause and effect of the corporate profit side of rising inflation is very difficult to evaluate, right? On the one hand, yes, corporate profits have gone up. On the other hand, they would naturally go up even if there was no price gouging, if there was less demand, because prices go up, which means profits go up. And then he turned to Stewart and he said, "You work for Apple, don't you?" Right? Which of course has seen I think Summers said 4 times more profits than ExxonMobil. And the question Summers was too much of a gentleman to ask was, why don't you ask for fewer millions of dollars? You would never accept fewer millions of dollars, right?
But I think that Jon Stewart really owned that, despite his paychecks literally being signed by Apple. He said, yes, he thinks that Apple makes too much money.
But he doesn't think that he makes too much money.
But here's where Jon Stewart, I think, really destroyed Larry Summers and all of these corporate millionaires like Larry Summers who constantly rally on MSNBC and CNN to make workers unemployed while they say we got to socialize profits. What he argued essentially was that when labor has too much power, when there's too much employment, they are causing too much demand and is driving inflation. And when Jon Stewart brought up price gouging, Larry Summers says, well, that's just the market at work. When there's demand, who am I to tell an employer, be it Apple or ExxonMobil or whomever, that they shouldn't be able to sell their product for what the market will bear? And Jon Stewart asked him then, why isn't the same true of workers? If workers have power in a tight labor market to demand more in the way of wages, why is it that you feel like the government needs to step in and cause massive unemployment in order to bring down inflation? Why is it that the government should only intervene to weaken the bargaining power of the poor and working class and not weakening the bargaining power of corporations by imposing wage gap?
I get that. Essentially he was saying, why would the government won't intervene if there's too much unemployment, but it will intervene if inflation is too out of control.
And it will intervene if there is too little unemployment, which is what it's doing now.
It actually goes a little bit to what you said just before we played that second clip of the hypocrisy of people who opposed, for instance, the COVID bailouts. I opposed them. But then also beg to have their deposits insured even beyond what they were actually insured vis-a-vis Silicon Valley Bank, et cetera, which is just the most unbelievable hypocrisy. Or people who don't want student loan debt forgiveness. Again, I don't want student loan debt forgiveness, but I also don't want any of these bailouts, or especially not for the tech venture capitalist class who they have to take on they take on risks, they know the risks, and if they pay off good, they get to profit from that. But if you lose. That's not the taxpayer's responsibility.
Right, and to your point, it never happens that when they win, they say, well, because we made public the risk, we're going to give the public some of these winnings, right? No, they keep it all for themselves. I think what bothered me about the clip was, that he sort of moved the goalpost, on the one hand denying that the payments to workers contributed to inflation. Of course they did. More money always does. We could say we're okay with that. We could say that was worth it, right? I think we would probably agree that it was worth it to a certain extent, maybe the first one, maybe not the second one, whatever. We could talk about that. But, to deny that contributed to inflation, I think is ridiculous. And then to move the goalpost to this very valid question about why the government only intervenes to protect the rich and to punish the poor, which I think is a great point and one we've talked about at length.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's worth noting when you look at Trump's $4.8 trillion tax cut proposals, Bill Maher characterized it as $6 trillion going into people's pockets. That didn't happen. What we saw was $1.8 trillion went to individuals and families, $1.7 trillion went to businesses. There's been ample discussion of the PPP funds and the difference between the discourse around what happened with that money and what could happen with potential student debt cancellation. But already off the bat, I think there's some bad faith framing from Bill Maher. And when you go back and look at what happened to the Trump tax cut money, 61.4% went to the richest 1%. 64.1% went to the richest 1%. We're not having any conversation about that $4.8 trillion of tax proposals effect on the economy in terms of inflation and spending. It's only a conversation when there's a public policy that benefits the poor. And it's really heartening, at least from my perspective, to see some real pushback happening in mainstream circles.
Yeah, Larry Summers coming in for a lot of criticism lately, I've noticed, from people in your circles.
Yeah, I've been mad at him since he told me that when I was a college student and he was my college president, that women just weren't that good at science. So as a science major, it got in my craw, I gotta say.
All right, more Rising right after this. Stay with us.